Hey yo, thank you for your interest in my poster talk. Who knows? My name is Björn Jörges, and I am a cognitive psychologist slash neuroscientist at York University in Toronto, in Canada. And I'm also very, very gay. My main project at the moment deals with the perception of self-motion, that is, with the perception of how far we have moved through our environment. There are three main ways we can estimate how far we have moved. We can use vision. So if you look at this video here, for example, you see that the world passes by you. And you can estimate how far you've moved through these cues. Then we have information from our vestibular system, which is located in our ears. It's also responsible for balance. And that, among other things, tells you about physical accelerations that your body experiences. So, for example, if you stand up, if you start moving forwards, and even about gravity. And finally, whenever your brain tells your body to do something, it also tells other parts of the brain what is going to happen or what should happen. So when we tell our body to walk forwards, we can also use this information, basically this like brain-to-brain communication, to estimate how far we are walking. One question here is how important each cue is. Usually in cognitive psychology, you would perform experiments where you basically knock out each of these cues and you look at what happens. So for example, you would move participants in the dark to knock out vision, but leave the vestibular cues intact. Or you would show them only visual stimulation, for example, in a virtual reality headset to knock out the vestibular information because they're still, but keeping visual information intact. But in our case, we have a big problem, which is that we can't just knock out gravity, which permanently impacts or is picked up by the vestibular system. So what do? We go to space, or rather, we send people to space because I'm not that cool. And that is where my current main project comes into play. This is called Convection. And the Convection project is a collaboration between our research group at York University and the Canadian Space Agency, who is really awesome to work with. Thanks to the CSA, we have access to astronauts before, during, and after their stay on the International Space Station. Here on the right, you can see a picture of the Canadian astronaut David Saint-Jacques while he's doing our experiment. As you can see here on the picture, well, more here, we use a virtual reality headset to present our stimulus. We're currently in the middle of data collection, and we have tested 5 astronauts out of 10 astronauts that we will test to, well, that will constitute the full data set. And we have also tested a control group of 20 participants on Earth. We assess our research question with 2 tasks. First, we test the distance astronauts travel subjectively. And then we have a control task to test how they perceive distances in space. We test them overall 5 times, once before their flight as a baseline, and then when they just arrive to the ISS. Then a 3rd time after about 90 days on the ISS. Then right after they can come back, and the last time 60 days later to check if their performance, if their perception has returned to the baseline before their flight. The first task, task 1, tests the participants' sense of how far they have traveled through their environment. We show them this hallway here in the virtual reality headset. First, there is this blue target, and they have to remember just how far away this target is ahead of them. Then the target disappears, and they start moving forwards. The marks on the walls, you can see here, pass by them and give them, well, the impression of them moving through the environment, and also some idea of how much distance they have covered. Then, when they thought, or when they think they reached the location where the target was before, they press a button to, well, indicate that they're there. We have pretty specific predictions for each test session that we illustrate in this schematic here. So you can see here on the x-axis the sessions. So before the flight, when they arrive to the ISS, then after having been in space for a while, then right after they come back, and a while later to see if their performances come back to baseline. On the y-axis, we have a ratio of the travel distance, so kind of the subjective judgment divided by the actual distance. That means that a value of 1 is basically perfect performance, and they go exactly as far as they're supposed to. A value under 1 means that they didn't go far enough, and a value over 1 means that they went too far. Our idea is that when the astronauts suddenly use gravity input because they arrive to the ISS, to a microgravity environment, the visual input becomes more important. That in turn means that less visual stimulation is needed for them to have the impression that they have moved the same distance. That in turn, lots of turns here, means that they think they arrive earlier at the target than they actually do. So we should observe a value below 1 when they just arrived to the ISS. Then, after getting used to microgravity, performance should go back to baseline, more or less. So we should find more or less the same performance as before the flight. Then, when they come back to Earth, we expect some kind of perturbation in their performance, but we have no directional hypothesis. So it might go up if they suddenly give less weight to vision and more weight to gravity. But it could also go down if the lack of gravity in space leads them to put generally a higher focus on vision, and that persists even on Earth for like a bit. This part of the experiment is more exploratory, as you might be able to tell. But then finally, after some time back on Earth, performance should go back to normal, and they should perform similar to the first test session. For the second task, where we test people's perception of distance, we showed them boxes of different sizes, and they have to judge for each box if it's bigger or smaller than a metal ruler they're holding in their hand. So they're holding them here, have the mouse in one hand, and respond for each box. We show them whether the box is smaller or bigger than this ruler they have in their hands. If they think that, that relation, like what they think of the size of the box, can tell us something about the perceived distance of the box. So because through some like trigonometry perspective magic, perceiving the cube as small would mean that they perceive it as very close. We have to test this because previous experiments have shown that distances are underestimated in space. So we have to kind of compare any difference we observe in the previous task, where we look at the travel distance against people's perception of distance. Boom, data. So as for the results, this is a very similar plot to the one I showed you before with the predictions. You have the 5 test session on the x-axis or x-axes. Then again, you have the ratio between travel distance and actual distance on the y-axis, with 1 being perfect performance. In addition, well, you have 2 panels. In one, I show you the performance of the astronauts, and in the second one, I show you performance of the controls that did all of this experiment on Earth. Then you have a different, like in the gradient from yellow to blue, you have each participant. You can see here 5 astronauts that have finished the task. And I'm also including a 6th one who is halfway through currently. And you have, well, the same thing for the controls. Each line corresponds to one of the 20 controls participants. And then you have the red line as mean across all participants within like this pool. So for all for astronauts on the left and for the controls on the right. With with the 5 astronauts, we have fully tested so far. I went off script there and had to find my script again. So so with 5 astronauts fully tested so far, we see first and foremost that there is absolutely no clear pattern in the results. Great. There is maybe an ever so slight undershoot when they go to space for the first time. Then after some time in space, they seem to overshoot with regards to baseline. And when they get back to Earth, they overshoot even more. So they go even further. And they don't seem to recover after 2 months back on Earth, which would be concerning. But as you can tell from looking at the controls over here, there is a lot of variability, both from one session to the next. So for example, if you follow this line, it's quite constant from session 1 to session 2, but then goes, well, it has like a ditch and then completely goes wild for the 4th and the 5th test session. And also there is quite some variability between subjects. So this subject here, the upmost one, is very different or performs very differently from the participant down here. So yeah, we obviously really have to get our full data set of 10 astronauts together before we can make any grand claims. This plot is very similar to the one I just showed you, but it's for task 2, so for the distance judgments. Here, a value below 1, which we observe in the data, means that the astronauts perceive the object as smaller, that is, as further away than it actually is. So here we can see that astronauts somewhat overestimate the distance in space with respect to the baseline. And this trend just seems to get worse and worse with each session, which is odd because previous research would lead us or would have us believe that distances are actually underestimated in space. And it shouldn't persist really for after the astronauts return to Earth. But yeah, given again all of the variability in the data, we'll really have to wait for the full data set. So overall, there may be a little undershoot in travel distance when astronauts go first up to space as predicted. And it seems that this change is not due to a misperception of the distance of the target, because as we've seen, participants actually overestimate the distance when they get into space. So maybe visual information really is more effective when astronauts first arrive at the ISS as predicted. But overall, there is definitely no absolutely clear and consistent effect across all astronauts. So we'll just have to wait and see. To finish up, a shout out to all of my amazing collaborators, Niels Buri, Megan McManus, Robert Allison, Michael Jenkin, and Lawrence Harris. Also, many thanks to the Canadian Space Agency, who's funding the project and helping us out with all sorts of nasty bureaucratic stuff. And finally, shout out to the Spanish association Prisma that promotes LGBTIQA-ness in science, technology, and innovation, where I am a board member. And we're also organizing a conference in Madrid in November, so check out our website, prismaciencia.org. Thanks for listening.